Hi, everyone. My name is Amirreza Hagigi. I'm the Director of Research and Education at the International Center for Genetic Disease and a lecturer on medicine at Harvard Medical School and Brigham and Women's Hospital. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the second lecture of our Medical Inclusion and Diversity Art series. This series is part of the Medical Inclusion and Diversity Art Program, or MEDAP, which is a partnership between the Harvard International Center for Genetic Disease, ICGD, Brigham and Women's Hospital, Harvard Medical School, and the Massachusetts College of Art and Design, or MassArt. MEDAP aims to address and promote diversity and representation of all kinds in the illustrations and visual artwork used in medical books, scientific literature, training, and patient engagement activities. Our Medical Inclusion and Diversity Art series highlights the topic that improves diversity, equity, and inclusion in healthcare. Today, we are pleased to be joined by Dr. Mary Grant, the president of Massachusetts College of Art and Design, who will provide opening remarks. And we are also delighted to host Dr. Ellis as our speaker, whom I will introduce separately. I would like to thank the leadership of the Harvard Medical School, Brigham and Women's Hospital, the Division of Genetics, and the Department of Medicine, especially Dr. Cole and Dr. Stone, and MassArt for their support. Dr. Mary Grant is a national leader in public higher education with more than 30 years of experience championing the arts, deepening community partnerships, cultivating civic engagement, and fostering access, diversity, equity, and inclusion across higher education. She's the president of Massachusetts College of Art and Design, the vice chair of the board of directors for the Norman Rockwell Museum, the board chair of Campus Compact, and recently served on the search committee for the new commissioner of higher education for Massachusetts. Prior to becoming the president of MassArt, Dr. Grant held numerous leadership positions in which she oversaw key social justice and civic engagement initiatives. Dr. Grant's role as senior administrative fellow at the Martin Richard Institute involved developing new partnerships and leading a task force focused on identifying and addressing factors contributing to systemic racism on campus and the wider community. During her time as president and CEO of the Edward Kennedy Institute of the United States Senate, Dr. Grant advanced the Institute's goal of civic engagement, participatory democracy, and inspiring the next generation of leaders by implementing strategic planning, identifying new financial support, and forging partnerships for success and sustainability. Dr. Grant holds a PhD from the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University, an MS in Public Affairs from the John W. McCormick Institute of Public Affairs at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, a BA in Sociology from Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts, North Adams State College, and an honorary doctorate from Williams College. I welcome Dr. Grant to deliver her remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Hagigi. So nice to see you and to be with you today. And welcome to all who have joined this important and thought-provoking discussion. As Dr. Hagigi mentioned, I am the president of the Massachusetts College of Art and Design. I've been in that role a little over a year and a half, and it has been a privilege. I will tell you a bit more about the college in a second, but please, I too want to extend my deep thanks to the team that has pulled this program together. The MIDAP program led by Dr. Hagigi and the team from Mass College of Art and Design, my colleagues, Dean Lisa Palawai and Associate Provost James Mason. They have been working hard together over the last year, forging this incredible partnership. We talk a great deal in higher education about collaboration and partnerships. They are more difficult to do, but when you build one that works as beautifully as this, the opportunities for success and change are profound. Bringing together these unique institutions to look at the issue of equity in medical illustration, equity in the medical field, is so inspiring and encouraging for the future. So today's conversation is one more in the series of educational opportunities about the work that's happening through this partnership. Mass College of Art and Design, for those of you who may not know, we are 150 years old this year. We are the only independent public college of art and design in the country. And we are established to address the critical issues facing the Commonwealth of Massachusetts as we move from the Industrial Revolution to the Innovation Revolution. And we are still doing that today. We are located in Boston, right around the corner from our good colleagues at Harvard Medical and the Brigham, where we get to do this work in partnership. And our students come from all over the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the country, and the world, where we're inspiring and creating the next generation of innovators, artists, makers, creators, designers, thinkers, and doers. And so this partnership is right in line with that. Our institution is deeply concerned about the impact of social equity and how we affect that in our curriculum. It's essential to the work that we do as a public institution. It is essentially in our DNA, but it doesn't mean that we're perfect, and we get better with every partnership that we do. So working in partnership with the MIDAP team, we have been looking at how do we influence the field of medical illustration? How do students from Harvard Medical School and students from Mass College of Art and Design team up to influence this field? And in influencing the field, we have the opportunity to save lives. When you look at the impact that art and design has on the medical field, from the healing professions to art therapy to social emotional needs, we know that art and creativity brings individuals together to look at issues from various perspectives, to address the complexities that may be getting in the way of solving a medical condition or understanding a cultural difference. We believe that this initiative will allow us to make the entry into the field for others who may not see themselves represented more attainable. If you don't see yourself represented, perhaps you don't think that this level of care or this level of support is accessible or meant for you. And that is essential to breaking down barriers to equity and equality in healthcare, economics, and almost every other issue that affects our daily lives. I am thrilled today that we're going to hear from Dr. Ellis Monk, and Dr. Hagigi will introduce him in a moment. And the work that Dr. Monk has done, as a sociologist myself, I'm profoundly moved by the influence that he has had in the field. And when I read some of his work around social stratification and color stratification, think about that work when we think about what it does in blocking people from economics, when the disparities in the criminal justice system, immigration issues, those issues too affect healthcare. So the very issues that we look at when we're talking about skin tone stratification impact entry into healthcare. And in an article that Dr. Monk wrote in 2021, he describes all of this, and he closes by saying that the importance of doing this is about pushing the boundaries of how we understand ethno-racial inequality today, and second, to radically reimagine ethno-racial equality in order to better inform our dreams for the future. And I can't think of a better way to enhance those dreams by looking at how we treat all members of our society equally. We remove those barriers, and we do it through these wonderful partnerships, this unique and distinct collaboration that we are so very proud to be a part of. So Dr. Hagigi, thank you for organizing today's conversation. Dean Palawai, Associate Provost Mason, my thanks to all of you. And Dr. Monk, thank you for the influence you have on this important topic. I look forward to today's conversation and the continued partnership between our wonderful, unique, and distinct institutions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Grant. Today, we are honored to host Dr. Ellis Monk as the second speaker of our Medical Inclusion and Diversity Art Series. Dr. Ellis Monk is an associate professor of sociology at Harvard University and a visiting faculty researcher at Google, where he works on skin tone, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. His award-winning research focuses on the comparative examination of ethno-racial inequality and colorism, especially in the domains of health disparities, the criminal justice system, and the labor market. He's a recent recipient of a $2.5 million NIH Director's New Innovator Award to support his research on skin tone, pulse oximetry, and health disparities. Ellis Monk earned his PhD in sociology from the University of California, Berkeley, and a BA in sociology from the University of Michigan and Arbor. He previously taught at the University of Chicago and Princeton University. It's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Monk as our today's speaker, who is going to talk about colorism and skin tone implications for health and medical devices. Ellis' lecture will be 40 minutes, and we will then open the session for question. Dr. Monk, thank you for accepting my invitation, and we are eager to hear your talk.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you for the excellent introduction, the warm words of Dr. Grant as well. Thank you all so much for attending this talk today. And I see that the clock is ticking, so I'll go ahead and jump right in. And what I'll be presenting today really proceeds in two parts. You can see my slides now, right? Good. Okay, perfect. So what I'll be talking about today really proceeds in two parts. So in the first half, I want to get everyone up to speed with the research on skin tone stratification and colorism. And then I'll transition to some of the implications for skin tone stratification and colorism in the domains of health, medical devices, and technology more broadly. So it's Black History Month. I think we've all heard this quote a million times from Dr. King, right? Will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And what this famous phrase is really doing is it's using something called metonymy, which is what King is saying is that he wants ethno-racial equality for all. He longs for a day when African Americans as a group would be no longer held back by systemic and systematic discrimination. But color in this formulation is a stand-in for African Americans' broad membership in the ethno-racial category Black that we see on the US Census. So this metonymy is really a common linguistic substitution where you're substituting the characteristic associated with a broader concept. So in this case, we're using color as a substitute for our concepts of race. But this slippage, right, the slippage where he's kind of substituting race and color is something really, really common. People do it all over the world. They do it in the US, they do it in Brazil, which is another case I have research on. But again, people understood what his point was, even though he's really doing this kind of metonymy here. And one of the main ideas that I'd like to get across in my research is that skin color and race are not equivalent concepts, even though, as I'll talk about today, both in my own research, kind of comparing and contrasting skin tone stratification with ethno-racial stratification, and also in the domains of health and medical devices and technology, people often conflate race and kind of this census category sense with skin color, even though they're not the same. And if we think about the origins of colorism and skin tone stratification in the United States, lots of these color hierarchies, at least among African Americans and whites, originated way back in slavery, where lighter skinned Blacks or mixed race Black people, mulattoes, were often favored over darker skinned so-called unmixed Blacks. And this, makes a lot of intuitive sense. Lighter skinned Blacks, mulattoes tended to have direct kinship ties to whites. And certainly, I think many of us know that there's a long history of sexual violence on the plantation that gave rise to this population of lighter skin and so-called mixed race Black people in the first place. But one thing to note is that the vast majority of the free Black population was composed of lighter skinned Blacks, mixed race Black people. And even after emancipation, right, these opportunities that lighter skinned people had and mixed race people had back in slavery accrued and were a form of cumulative advantage over time, because these people with direct kinship ties to whites were far more likely to, say, know a skilled trade or know how to read or even be freed during slavery, hence the vast majority of the free Black population being composed of lighter skinned Blacks and mulattoes. Now, one thing I like to note is that even though, as far as we're concerned in 2023 and for many, many decades, people have thought about Blackness as this idea around the one drop rule, this idea that regardless of your phenotype, your skin tone, your facial features, or your ancestries, it's really just one drop of Black blood and you self-identify as Black, you're classified as Black. And that's the census way of thinking about it. But if we go back to the turn of the 20th century, even in 1910, US Census enumerators noted that about 21% of the Black population was so-called visibly mulatto. And that is to say that during this period of transition from slavery to Jim Crow, we also see a transition where the one drop rule is becoming imposed top down in the United States in such a way that even other African Americans who, up until a certain point, people who are mixed race or lighter skinned, there's great books on this, like Aristocrats of Color, for instance, actually practice homogamy and other forms of social closure, because we have to keep in mind that during this period of transition before the one drop rule was fully embraced by even African American people, there are parts of the South that recognized like tri-racial hierarchies like Louisiana and South Carolina, where the one drop rule was resisted well into the 20th century. So as I like to point out in my research, right, it's actually the case in the United States that insofar as the black-white racial axis is concerned in terms of categorization and classification, we've actually gone a lot longer without the one drop rule in terms of its official institutionalization and embrace by not just whites top down imposing it with the end of slavery, but also other African Americans embracing this one drop rule as the means of political mobilization. And there is lots of conflict over whether or not the one drop rule should actually be embraced, as opposed to highlighting color differences and ancestral differences within the Black population. So on this slide, I have a picture of W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey, and they famously, nastily fought over who they thought should be the rightful leader of the Black community in terms of its politics. And Marcus Garvey argued that darker skinned Black people, so-called unmixed Black people, should lead the political vanguard. And this was something that Du Bois argued very strongly against, instead arguing that all Black people, regardless of their skin color and ancestral mixes, should come together, embrace the one drop rule, and be one group to fight for their rights together. Now, of course, we know in 2023 that Du Bois's argument won the day. And that's, of course, why we have things like the NAACP. In one picture here, I have Roy Wilkins, Walter White in the middle, Thurgood Marshall. Walter White in the middle there was really well known for being able to pass for white. Phenotypically, people wouldn't necessarily believe that he had Black ancestry, that he was a Black man. He was a co-founder of the NAACP, and one of the things that he was famous for doing was going throughout the South during Jim Crow and reporting on lynchings, because he could actually blend in to the crowd and kind of be undetected, okay? So one of the take-home points I really want to emphasize here at the beginning of the talk is that census category race and skin color are not the same characteristic. And even among African Americans, you see a wide array of different skin tones and phenotypical features. And this is some data from the 2010 and 2000 census, just showing, highlighting that the one drop rule is alive and well today, even with the advent of marking one or more on the US Census. Barack Obama famously said, well, he just identifies as Black, and lots of quantitative and qualitative evidence in the social sciences suggests that even as being multiracial, biracial, et cetera, is becoming more and more accepted, the reality is that over the life course, most people who are so-called mixed race or lighter skin with the category Black tend to just identify monoracially as Black. So in my research on skin tone stratification and colorism, one of the key ideas here, again, is that census race and skin color are not the same characteristics. So when we imagine ethno-racial inequality in our society, a lot of the time we think about these broad census categories of Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, Latinx, et cetera, right? But the reality is that there's a lot of evidence for many decades now, which shows that this is a very truncated and kind of simplistic way of thinking about ethno-racial inequality in our society. So this talk really focuses on what I feel are two forms of erasure, two forms of color blindness. One, and I'll talk about this in this first part of the talk, is ignoring skin tone stratification within and across our traditional kind of census style categories, but then also how that kind of color blindness has also really had huge consequences in the realms of health, medical devices, and technology. So this may be somewhat counterintuitive, but one of the main findings across much of my papers is that there's as much socioeconomic inequality along the color continuum among African Americans as there is between African Americans and whites as a whole. And of course, there's also research which shows similar results among Hispanics, Latinx, as well as Asian Americans to some extent as well, and immigrants who are coming to the United States. There's some excellent studies on skin tone and discrimination on the basis of skin tone as something that gets in the way of assimilation and integration of new immigrants in the United States. So one finding that illustrates this is education. So if we were to compare Blacks and whites in the United States aged 25 to 44, we would find that whites as a group on average have 10.2 months more education than African Americans. And I think that basically, is common sense that whites have more education on Black people in the United States. But one thing I did using a nationally representative survey in the United States looking at African Americans is if we looked along the entire skin tone continuum within the Black population, there's a gap of education between the lightest and the darkest skinned African Americans of 15.4 months. And what this finding is showing, somewhat counterintuitively, when we think about the broader discussions in our society around race and racial inequality and justice, is that there's actually more inequality within the Black population in terms of education than there is between Blacks and whites as a whole. And again, we see these kind of similar results even in the criminal justice system, where there's a lot of discussion on the relative importance of race versus class. So some of you may have heard statistics, for instance, showing the great effect of a college education on the probability that someone will ever have been arrested or incarcerated. And some people argue that this shows that class, socioeconomic status, education is more important than race. Now, I've always felt that was kind of a simplistic way of thinking about racial inequality in the United States. But one thing I did in one of my published studies was essentially hold race and class into account when we're thinking about racial inequality in the criminal justice system. So in this study, I have a nationally representative sample of African Americans and a subsample of white Americans. And I'm able to look at within the Black population along the color continuum, for instance, what is the probability that someone has ever been arrested? And what I find there is that certainly there is a gap between Blacks and whites as a whole, where Blacks on average have higher rates of having ever been arrested. But look what happens within the Black population along the skin tone continuum. That gap between the very lightest and the very dark skin is somewhat similar, at least according to the results from this particular study, to what we see in the gap in arrest between Blacks and whites as a whole, which is, again, I think, a very counterintuitive way of thinking about race in the criminal justice system. But there's a series of papers which look at the role of colorism and skin tone stratification in criminal sentencing, administering the death penalty. And I have a project which I've launched with a few of my colleagues where we're looking at police killings in terms of race and color as well, which is to say that our common ways of thinking about race and racial inequality tend to marginalize this other form of stratification, which in some cases is larger in magnitude than just thinking in kind of this dichotomous or nominal way between categories. And this is just a plot of that finding. And one key point I'd like to make here is that this is holding race constant, essentially, and taking education, income, employment into account. You still have this large effect, this large relationship between skin tone and the probability of having been arrested, particularly among Black men, which is to say that a lot of the discussion about race versus class, well, I understand that conversation, but even when we take that into account, we still have this skin tone relationship with arrest within the Black population. Now, as was mentioned in the opening, there's also work I've done looking at colorism, skin tone stratification on the labor market. And with some colleagues of mine, Hetty Lee, who's at Duke University, and Michael Esposito, who's at the University of Minnesota this fall, we took things up a notch because we wanted to look intersectionally at the roles of colorism and lookism and gender on the labor market. Lookism is discrimination on the basis of physical appearance. And one of the main questions in this paper is, do returns to perceptions of physical attractiveness or beauty vary at the intersections of race and gender on the labor market? And there's lots of research on wage gaps in the labor market between men and women, between Black and white people, this kind of nominal dichotomous approach to thinking about inequality in our society. But what we do is we look at the literature on returns to attractiveness, which shows somewhat depressingly that the returns for physical attractiveness may be even larger than returns for actual ability, which, yeah, very depressing finding. But what we want to do in this study, and what we did in this study, was look at the role of race and look at the roles of race and gender in combination. Daniel Hammermesh is usually seen as kind of like the forefather, the kind of leading light in this research on beauty on the labor market, but he actually surmised that the effects of beauty within the Black population on the labor market might actually be smaller than among whites. And as we pointed out in this paper, there's no real reason to believe that theoretically, if we take very seriously the work that's been done by Black feminists in particular, showing that beauty is racialized and gendered, and skin tone, facial features, all of these things are coded in ways that make darker skin, more Afrocentric appearances, usually associated with lower scores in terms of physical attractiveness, while more Eurocentric facial features, skin tone, et cetera, tend to receive higher scores of physical attractiveness. And if we take that, this idea of intersectionality and the racialization and the gendering of beauty very seriously, then we should actually expect that while most Black people, Black women in particular, may be facing a form of triple jeopardy, where there's discrimination on the basis of their race, their gender, and these notions of beauty, where color plays a large role in these notions of beauty. The exceptions to the rule, people who are lighter skinned, have more Eurocentric facial features, et cetera, may actually profit greatly on the labor market. So this is a plot of perceptions of perceived attractiveness using a nationally representative survey called Ad Health. And most of the interviewers in this particular survey are white, which in our study is a feature, not a bug, because we want to simulate this kind of gatekeeping on the labor market. And what this shows is that it is certainly the case that Black people tend to receive lower attractiveness scores from the vantage point of this pool of mostly white interviewers. And Black women in particular are receiving lower scores. Even worse in terms of what Black men are receiving in terms of lower scores. And this is the plot of earnings along this kind of spectrum of perceived attractiveness. And one thing to note here is that in this study, we also looked at the relationship between skin tone and BMI in these scores. And there's an extremely strong relationship there, especially with skin tone. And what we show here is that certainly skin tone comes into play in such a way that African Americans are receiving these lower scores and are getting lower earnings on the labor market. But attractiveness matters for everyone on the labor market. But one thing that goes on, particularly for Black women, is that Black women who do receive higher scores, their earnings actually cross over and converge with that of white women of higher levels of perceived attractiveness. And this just kind of gives the numeric breakdown if we were to think the lower fifth percentile of the spectrum of perceived attractiveness and the highest fifth percentile. And you can see, even for white men, that gap in earnings is 88 cents to $1. Which is actually a little bit larger than the Black-white race gap using the same data set, which is 87 cents to $1. But when you look at what goes on within these categories, you look among Black women, for instance, and Black men, you see 61 cents to $1 between the fifth and the highest fifth percentile, the fifth and the 95th percentile, and 63 cents to $1 for Black women, which is to show that race, gender, colorism, looks, all of these things are operating on the labor market in such a way that when we take all of these different dimensions of stratification into account, and we're fully intersectional in our approach. Even in this quantitative study, there's actually more inequality when we take these dimensions together than if we were to just compare men to women or Black people to white people, right? This is a different way of imagining stratification on the labor market. And this has relevance for patient-physician relationships. There's a couple of projects I'm already involved in looking at colorism and patient-physician treatment and relationships. And there's a series of audit studies that I'm crafting right now looking into this further in terms of patient-physician relationships and treatments as well with an NSF-funded postdoc. Now, the vast majority of my research focuses on ethno-racial health disparities, so I want to walk through some of that work, again, looking beyond the binary of just looking between categories. So there's a lot of work, and I think the people who are watching this know this work pretty well, which shows that there are just enormous disparities, health disparities between Blacks and whites. So one really infamous finding is from McCord and Freeman way back in 1990, showing that Black male youth in 1980 were less likely to survive to the age of 65 than male youth in Bangladesh. And David R. Williams, who I think a lot of people on this in the audience probably know pretty well, has shown that there's a 5-year gap in life expectancy at age 25 between Blacks and whites. But it is also the case that health disparities between Blacks and whites often remain even after we control for SES and health behaviors. And Williams points out that health disparities within race, and again, this is a theme, are often as large or even larger than between race health disparities. So how do we begin to kind of unravel these complexities? So in my research, one of the ways that I've done this, and this kind of picks up on the idea here, which is health disparities remaining after controlling for SES and health behaviors. There's a lot of research looking at discrimination as a form of social stress that can have negative downstream effects on both mental and even physical health. And what this diagram is showing here is, one of the kind of main theses in this body of research looking at social stress is this idea of the dysregulation of the HPA axis, the repeated activation of it in particular, leading to short-term and long-term stress responses that are bad for physical health, not just mental health, as some early research seemed to suggest. So what I did in a paper that came out in 2015 was to look at skin color as a risk for exposure to various dimensions of discrimination. So one is everyday discrimination. This is the David R. Williams measure of discrimination that I think many people in the audience probably know pretty well. And what I show in one of the papers is that as skin tone becomes darker within the Black population, there is a higher frequency of perceived everyday discrimination. And everyday discrimination is associated with a whole range of different, mental and physical health outcomes. But the other thing I did in this particular study and some follow-up work was to look at skin color discrimination, both as perceived between Blacks and whites, but also crucially within the Black population, this kind of canonical idea of colorism, this intra-categorical, this intra-racial form of skin tone discrimination. So while it's certainly the case that skin color, as it increases in darkness, you have a greater perception of colorism perceived from whites, and this has negative effects on mental health and physical health, the patterning of the relationship between skin tone and intra-racial skin color discrimination is actually much more complicated. And this is something that was pointed out by sociologists St. Clair Drake and Horace Caton in Black Metropolis. And this is something a lot of people who are Black know pretty well. And we see similar dynamics even among Hispanics, Latinx. But the finding here is that people who are on either extreme of the skin tone continuum, those who are very light and very dark, perceive dramatically, significantly more intra-racial skin color discrimination than those in the middle of the Black population, that middle of the skin tone continuum. And what this means then is, to the extent that intra-racial skin color discrimination is a form of social stress, that leads to negative mental and physical health outcomes, right? the patterning, the relationship between skin color and mental and physical health may be somewhat more complicated than just saying, well, the darker you are, the worse off you are. And depending on the measure of mental or physical health, you may get some complexities there. I think the form of intra-racial discrimination I'm highlighting here, the skin color intra-racial discrimination, is really important to take seriously because it's a form of discrimination that's very unique analytically and empirically than kind of thinking about just racial discrimination between categories. Rejection from the in-group, and there's lots of social psychological research on this, is likely to be extremely damaging for health. It takes away a common coping mechanism. This is a form of discrimination that tends to take place among friends, among family. It can catch victims with their guard down. And crucially, going back to Dr. King, right, there's a lot of socialization that people get about how to deal with racism, how to deal with racial inequality, but there's a lot less socialization around colorism. And even lookism, which works in concert with colorism, one thing to note about that is that that's a form of discrimination that's actually legal. And there's been some progress on that. Things like the Crown Act, which is outlawing hair discrimination on the labor market, but it's extremely difficult to launch and win a lawsuit on the basis of color or perceptions of attractiveness. So again, this is a form of discrimination and axis of inequality in our society where people have less resources to deal with it, and it's something that's quite pernicious. And as I show in my research, the magnitude of its association with even physical health outcomes after we control for a whole host of different factors rivals that of everyday discrimination and even major lifetime discrimination, which is another measure of discrimination that's well known in the epidemiological literature on social stress and discrimination. The other reason why looking at intra-racial skin color discrimination I think is really important is because in one of my papers, I suggest that it's one way of kind of unraveling the Black-white mental health paradox. So what is the Black-white mental health paradox? So as many of us know, there are enormous, mental and physical health disparities between Blacks and whites in the United States, right? And we would expect that given the physical health disparities between Blacks and whites, we should also see mental health disparities between Blacks and whites. But there's quite a bit of research which strongly suggests that mental health among African Americans may be somewhat similar to whites or maybe even better than whites as a whole. And this is the kind of mental health paradox that people in the literature have spoken about. And there's lots of ideas around why this kind of relationship would exist, from ethno-racial differences in interpreting the questions, to heightened socialization around racism, to the extent that, according to Corey Keyes at Emory, a sociologist, Black people may flourish amidst discrimination, amidst racial discrimination. They may use their racial identity as a form of protection, right? The reality is there's still a lot to learn about this paradox. So in one of my papers, what I did was I looked within the Black population along the skin tone continuum, and I looked at a screening mechanism for depression. And what I found there was if we take intra-racial heterogeneity very seriously, even though it is the case that whites, according to this nationally representative data set, tend to have higher rates of depression than Blacks, the reality is both the very darkest and the very lightest skinned African Americans tended to have mental health in terms of depression rates that were similar to whites as a whole. So this is one way of kind of dissolving the mental health paradox, is to move beyond these broad ethno-racial categories from the census and take this heterogeneity in skin tone, facial features, et cetera, very seriously within the Black population among ethno-racial minorities, because this is another way that their social experiences of stereotyping and discrimination unfolds for them in their daily lives. And there's even been some work that's been done using sibling difference models trying to understand the relationship between skin tone and health. And some of these studies are showing even when they do family fixed effects, they find these differences in health among full-blooded siblings of slightly different skin tones. So again, even though a lot of the ways that we think about ethno-racial health disparities tend to highlight race, there's a lot of research and growing body of research, I think, which is showing pretty convincingly that skin tone is also extremely important, and it's an axis of inequality that a lot of the ways that we imagine race and racial inequality tends to ignore. So that being said, I want to transition into the second part of the talk, which is, well, I've shown how much skin tone stratification matters in the United States, and certainly it's a global issue, but I've talked about the United States, and there's a bit of color blindness around skin tone and colorism in our society. But this color blindness is also something that has happened in the realm of technology. So, for instance, if we look at the history of developing color film, Kodak, in this day and age, infamously used these things called Shirley cards, where lab techs would use a picture of a white woman, Shirley, and if Shirley looked good, then the picture was good. And apparently, it took complaints from corporate furniture and chocolate manufacturers to push Kodak to try to fix this kind of inherent color photography bias, because chocolate companies complained that the chocolates didn't look right, and furniture companies complained about the lack of variation in the different color woods in their ads. There was a lack of dynamic range in capturing kind of brown and the kind of variations that we see, brown to black colors. But it wasn't until the mid 1990s that Kodak began to create these kind of multiracial Shirley cards. But by then, the damage had already been done. And we shifted to digital photography, which means even to this very day, developing color films, and there's filmmakers who are still filming on like 35 millimeter film, for instance, still kind of deal with, the difficulties of capturing non-white skin on film. And this sort of inherent lack of inclusion is something that's also affecting pulse oximetry. So health disparities, certainly there's social stress and other factors, right? But they can also be partially attributed to these algorithmic technological biases embedded within our technologies. And the same issue that kind of plagues color film processing like Kodak exists in pulse oximetry and even other devices, because many and most of these medical technologies were validated on mostly homogeneous groups of white patients. And pulse oximetry in particular is susceptible to these biases because it's based on using red and infrared light to shine, light through your tissue to so-called see your blood. Oxygenated hemoglobin absorbs infrared light more efficiently than it does red light. And the opposite is true for deoxygenated hemoglobin. So that's kind of the basic idea of kind of tracking your oxygenation levels, is that you can use this light to kind of measure that. But light photons may propagate very differently in darker skin versus lighter skin. This is a great illustration of that was in Nature, which shows that the melanosomes and melanocytes, the number and the size of them are different in light versus dark skin, obviously, right? And the idea here is that the melanocytes and the melanosomes may actually interfere, they may scatter the light, and that means that you're getting less signal back to the device. And there's a team of physicians at the Hypoxia Lab, and I'll talk a little bit more about them in a little bit, because I've joined their cause, so to speak, with this NIH grant that I have. But they noted that in their 18 years of testing pulse oximeter accuracy, so they're one of the main labs that test these devices for the FDA, most of the subjects have been light skinned. Almost all of these devices have been calibrated on white groups of patients. And they have a series of papers going back to the early 2000s showing already that skin pigmentation led, or at least was associated with, lower accuracy of pulse oximeters, particularly at lower rates of saturation. So just some numbers here to kind of put to some of these this work. one thing to highlight here is that at lower oxygen levels, starting around 90, at 90 and below, you can see the inaccuracies in these pulse oximeters on darker skinned subjects grow and grow and grow. So the problem is exacerbated precisely at the point where you're getting worse, right? And this means that, for instance, this is a story that someone is sharing here, but if we think about the kind of decision rules that a lot of physicians have had, especially during the pandemic, this has meant that darker skinned people, and really actually non-white people, because there's even errors among Latinx, indigenous people, Asian people, people who aren't white, these devices may be less accurate, and that means delayed care or lack of care. And this has downstream consequences, particularly in the COVID pandemic. This has led almost undoubtedly to some of the health disparities we're seeing in terms of morbidity and mortality in the pandemic. And unfortunately, this is an issue where color blindness has really come into play, because just as colorism is not new, there's research on colorism, even though it remains somewhat marginal as a topic. There is evidence of errors in pulse oximetry going back to the 90s, maybe even the late 80s. Now, one paper that really was famous kind of for popularizing this idea around inaccuracy in pulse oximetry was the Schoeding paper that was in the New England Journal of Medicine, which showed these differences between Black and white patients. And this actually showed that, for instance, right, people self-identifying as Black had their eligibility for oxygen treatment delayed or missed altogether, compared with just 20% of the white people documented, right? And, occult hypoxemia, this is a serious issue, and it's being missed, right? But one thing to note here is that the measure of skin tone, so to speak, in this particular paper is actually just race. And this is one of the issues that's come to a head, particularly as people like Senators Elizabeth Warren and other people have actually forced the FDA to begin to do that work to revise their standards. And I'm involved with the group, the Open Oximetry group, and the hypoxia lab that I mentioned, where we're actually beginning to do research, foundational research to inform what some of these standards should be. But the point is to say that a lot of these studies on race and skin tone and pulse oximetry don't even actually measure skin tone. They use race as a proxy for skin tone. And as I've said at length in today's talk, race and skin tone are not the same characteristic. And this really gets us down to the standards that the FDA has, that the ISO have for measuring skin tone, and the kind of ways that they're regulating pulse oximetry, because according to current regulations, you need 2 volunteers or 15% of your study group when you're testing and validating and calibrating these devices. They should be darkly pigmented, right, according to the FDA. But the question is, of course, well, is 15% enough? And who exactly is darkly pigmented? And the prevailing standard that's being used is the Fitzpatrick skin type scale, which was developed in 1975 at Harvard Medical School by Thomas Fitzpatrick. But it wasn't actually designed for the classification of skin tone. It's actually something that was intended to categorize how skin tone reacts to UV during phototherapy. And there's a lot of studies which unfortunately show that it's inconsistent even when used for this particular purpose. But nevertheless, it's been adopted as kind of a gold standard for skin tone categorization, despite not being designed for this purpose and not even sometimes adequately being consistent enough even for that purpose. And sometimes in a lot of papers, the Fitzpatrick is used as a proxy for race. So on the one hand, we have studies that don't measure skin tone. And then we have studies that do, but they use a Fitzpatrick scale. And then they use a Fitzpatrick scale as a proxy for race. Lots and lots of confusion, right? So one thing to note here is that there's been a groundswell, really, of people clamoring for an alternative to the Fitzpatrick scale in particular. One thing that's been noted is that originally there were only 4 tones on that scale, and 2 were later added. But the reality is that, it's something that people have been clamoring for an alternative to. In particular, this is really important because if we don't have an adequate measure of skin tone, then when we're putting together a group to actually calibrate these devices, whether they are pulse oximeters or bilirubin detectors or near infrared spectroscopy. Of course, I'm not going to say that right during my presentation, but the reality is all of these light sensing devices are susceptible to these same issues. So in my work with the Open Oximetry Project and with the people of the Hypoxia Lab, we're doing a lot of studies using the Monk skin tone scale, which has been adopted by Google for very similar reasons in the kind of world of artificial intelligence and machine learning, where they also had been using the Fitzpatrick scale until last year when they launched this project with me to categorize skin tone in terms of annotating data that they use to drive their image search algorithms, that they use to test the filters for the Pixel camera phone and all kinds of other things, right? And they ran into the same issue, which is that there was a truncated range of different skin tones with the Fitzpatrick scale, and they needed an alternative. And research that I've been doing with Google already shows that the Monk scale is perceived as significantly more inclusive than the Fitzpatrick scale, and that annotators actually are able to reach consensus using the scale, even though it is a subjective visual-based scale. So in closing, one thing I want to note is that everything that I've said about skin tone and colorism, these kind of forms of color blindness, it's not just social stress and discrimination. We see it in the realm of medical technology. We see it in pulse oximetry. We see it in terms of the bilirubin detectors, the infrared thermometers, and we even see it in the realms of artificial intelligence and machine learning, where again, ignoring the diversity, the heterogeneity within and across different ethno-racial categories has led to a form of blindness, such that some studies show, for instance, that autonomous cars can't recognize pedestrians with darker skin tone, which in a lot of their testing shows that that means darker skinned people who aren't white, are actually at higher risk of being hit by self-driving vehicles. And on a last note, this is something that we see in the realm of medical textbook imagery. Again, the lack of inclusion of a diverse set of people when we're thinking about making a textbook or a database of images of different skin conditions leads to poor training for physicians and clinicians when they're actually dealing with a diverse set of patients in terms of diagnosing their skin tones and giving them treatment. So one thing I'll say in closing is that I've been working with the health equity team at Google, and we've launched this skin condition image network, which is now up and running, trying to kind of fix this gap in medical imagery that we hope downstream would be the basis of maybe an online database of a diverse set of skin condition images along the entire skin tone conditions, along the entire skin tone continuum that will be categorized by the different Monk skin tones. So I'll stop there. I see I'm running out of time, so I'll go ahead and stop there and get to the Q&A. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Dr. Monk. Now, if you have a question, please raise your hand and we will unmute you. Please introduce yourself before asking your question. So I have a question. I received a question, so I can read that one. How can we address issues related to skin tone and healthcare disparities at the policy level?
Right. That's a great question. It's something that I'm currently working on in terms of the realms of pulse oximetry and medical technology. I do think beyond that, we need to begin to think about in terms of like even admissions in terms of our schools, like looking beyond just these categorical race categories and taking more seriously that there's skin tone and all kinds of other forms of diversity that we should be taking very seriously as well in terms of, who becomes a doctor or not, who becomes a nurse or not, et cetera, right? So I think we need to take a much more complicated approach of thinking about diversity very seriously. But in terms of policy, I think these regulatory standards, these are something that need to be addressed immediately. And I've been very happy to see that the FDA is beginning to take some of these issues very seriously. I'm hoping that we'll make some progress there because whatever whatever we do in the United States, for better or for worse, will have an effect around the world in terms of the official standards of measurement for skin tone and also regulating devices above and beyond pulse oximeters.
Thank you very much. Dr. Stone?
Hi, Dr. Monk. Thanks very much for your presentation. It was very revealing, but I think also somewhat intuitive that this is something that we've all been seeing every day in our lives, but nobody ever provides any data about it. And I guess my question is a little bit more sounding like a researcher. I didn't quite understand how you got the data that categorized people's skin tone that enabled you to do the analyses on differences by education and differences by, interaction with the justice system. Where'd that data come? How do you do that? I think many of us who do health equity research would love to have that, would love to have that data because these are such important questions that we would love to research further.
Absolutely. No, thank you. Thank you so much. So those series of papers, right, all use this thing called the National Survey of American Life, which was conducted University of Michigan, the ISR, the Institute for Social Research, and the Program for Research on Black Americans, which was led by James S. Jackson, Robert J. Taylor, David R. Williams. So essentially the measure of skin tone that they used was interviewer rated skin tone that I'm using in these studies. They just ask people, they do race matching. So if African Americans rate the skin tone of other African Americans. There's also a self-rated measure of skin tone that I use in the data set as well. But for the socioeconomic stuff and the criminal justice stuff, I tend to use the interviewer rated skin tone measures. Of course, another way to measure skin tone is to use my scale, but that's some newer research I'll be doing with that.
That's newer research. That's great.
Yep.
Thank you very much. Is there any chance you could put like one of those in the chat or give it to the organizers? The survey or one of the papers so that we could.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Dr. Stone, for all your support. Next question, Dr. Shakil.
Hello. Thank you, Dr. Monk. I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much for your presentation. I like the idea of color with pulse oximetry and some medical investigation. Do you mind sharing your knowledge regarding the other intervention in terms of skin color, like infrared treatment or ultraviolet treatment?
So do you mean in terms of the accuracy and inaccuracy around those forms of technology?
Exactly.
Yeah, so,
does it affect the light color versus dark color patient, the dosage of that treatment?
So there are some studies that suggest, yes, actually, that those treatments are not equally effective along the skin tone continuum. And that's precisely because a lot of these technologies were not normed and calibrated across the entire skin tone continuum. And even something like the Fitzpatrick scale, there's studies which show that it is kind of poorly predictive of sun tanning and even how people respond to plastic surgery, again, at the darker end of that scale. So yes, absolutely. There needs to be much more research on how to use those kind of treatment modalities along the entire skin tone continuum. Yes.
Because we know the incidence of melanomas are much higher in white colored people as compared to the dark color. Okay.
Yes, so that's absolutely. Yes, yes, that's absolutely true. But unfortunately, one of the kind of side effects there is that people, first of all, assume that darker skinned people don't get melanoma. So even though it's rare, it doesn't mean that they don't get it. But then it's also way harder to diagnose because it's rare and it's on darker skin and there's less images that people are trained with to be able to detect it in the first place. And even some of our, dermatoscopes may not work as equally well on darker skin.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. The next question, Dr. Potri.
Hello, thank you so much for this wonderful talk, extremely fascinating. I'm calling in from Ghana. So greetings from Accra, Ghana. I'm also a global health fellow at Harvard University School of Public Health. So I'm quite familiar with the work here, and it's amazing. My question has a lot more to do with the global health dynamic. Have you considered maybe some of the implications of your work in places like South Africa, Brazil? I did some work in South Africa as well, and I just could see a lot of some of the similar conclusions based on the context thereof. And then my second question is, I study a measurement called street race in reproductive healthcare, where we analyze colorism in maternal care in the U.S. It's published in the Journal of Maternal and Child Health. So have you thought about street race and perceptions of race at the level of first glance appearances? So those are my top two questions. Thank you.
I'll thank you, first of all, for coming. Thank you for your question. So I'll go in reverse. So yeah, I know Nancy Lopez pretty well. She was really instrumental for me when I was just starting off as a graduate student even. So I'm very well acquainted with street race. And I do think that more research on street race, even in the kind of clinician patient relationship, I think that's one way of, even if you don't have a measure of skin tone per se in your study, this is one way of trying to add more complexity to our understanding of what's actually going on between doctors and their patients and how patients are being treated, right? So I completely agree with that. In terms of the global health implications, so absolutely. First of all, some of my research is on Brazil. And all of these issues that I'm talking about pertaining to Black people or darker skinned people, this is absolutely going to be something that happens in South America, the African continent, all over Asia, et cetera, which is that a lot of the devices that we're sending around the world from the global north, the first world, so to speak, to the global south, right, to poor countries, they're going to be less accurate, first of all. They're not normed on darker skin tones, and we're sending them to countries. People are buying them in countries where the skin tone distribution is more skewed to the darker end of the spectrum. So all of this has really huge implications for global health. And in particular, this idea around like measuring skin tone, there's a lot of discussion around, well, why don't we use an objective measure of skin tone and do our studies? And I think there is, room for that. But not everyone's going to be able to buy a mexameter or a colorimeter or what have you to set up their studies and to norm and test their different treatments, right? So we also need a subjective scale that's cheap and easy for people to use all over the world. And that's where my scale came into play, of course, from a global health perspective. So I think there are huge ramifications for everything I said in the global health frame. And actually, if anything, it's even worse when we think about scaling up globally because most people around the world are not white.
Thank you very much, Dr. Monk. The last question, Jill.
Thank you. Thank you for a great presentation. So I was wondering if the pulse oximeters and facial recognition technology, et cetera, do you think that they'll have to be calibrated depending on skin color, or is it possible to just have a wide range and have something that works on all skin tones?
Right. So I'm glad you mentioned facial recognition software as well, because this is another realm where you have the same issue. And this is leading to both false positives and false negatives because a lot of the algorithms were not trained across the entire skin tone continuum, or they use a Fitzpatrick scale, which is truncated. It's actually too dark for white people and not dark enough for Black people. So it has kind of two issues going on simultaneously. And I think to quickly answer your question, we're going to need to recalibrate everything. I think we can't get around recalibrating the algorithms, hence Google launching the project that they did with me, where they're recalibrating everything from the image search, the Fitbit, almost anything you can think of that's light sensing, computer vision, they're recalibrating. And it's the same with the pulse oximeters. As part of the NIH grant that I have, I'm working with a physicist and an engineer. One thing we're looking into on the device side is thinking about measuring pulse oximetry in a way that's less susceptible to the scattering that you see, between skin tone and the light signal. And there may be some ways of separating out measuring the pulse and measuring oxygen and doing kind of engineering fixes. But long story short is, things need to be recalibrated. And if they're not, we're going to keep having these problems.
Right. Yeah, that was my question, whether everything will have to be calibrated for an individual or whether we can instead just use different technologies like you're mentioning with the pulse oximeter. Maybe we can get around doing.
Right. So maybe we can make different technologies, but the other thing to do is just to have study, pools of patients that are actually diverse in their skin tone, measured however, but measured more accurately than, say, the Fitzpatrick scale, and making sure that things work across a wide array of different skin tones. And that probably, I think, still leads you back to not using red light and infrared with pulse oximetry. It might be very difficult to get that to work because of the scattering that you get with melanocytes in particular.
Thank you very much. Okay, this is the end of our session for today. Thank you everyone for joining us for this informative talk in this series, and we look forward to seeing you at our future events. Thank you.